morning, and I hope you really had a nice rest. And I wish I was here also yesterday, but yeah, time is short, so I'm only here this morning, and I'm looking forward to more discussions after lunch in the labs. So just to maybe clarify that I'm not a youth researcher, I don't come from the academia, so I will not give concepts. I'm rather a practitioner, and throughout years I've been, of course, wearing different hats. So I started as an activist in Romania, and then I moved to advocacy, and now I work at European level. So I will just try to give you my perspective from the different angles that I had the chance to work with young people and decision makers and youth workers equally. My background, and I've started working more and more in democratic participation in elections. So I will try to approach this topic, this discussion from this perspective of democracy and youth participation, basically. When it comes to, when I'm thinking about the youth policy and the programs approach, I mean, the questions that I had in mind were, how are young Europeans experiencing solidarity through the youth programs? And I'm aware that we have a program that is called like that. What democratic participation and solidarity, but with whom? With whom are we showing solidarity? Is there a space for innovation in youth policy making? Especially now in a key moment when we are evaluating the EU youth program. So we are going through the midterm evaluation, but also we are starting next year to discuss about the new EU youth strategy from 2028 onwards. And what role can the youth sector play in innovating for democracy? And the first thing that, especially this year, when we listen to news, when we listen to policy experts, academia, we know there is a disillusionment with democracy. And if you look at the data, yeah, you can still hear me. If you look at the data, it's only 8% of the world population that lives in full democracy. IDEA, the International Organization for Electoral Democracy, they have a very nice index where they measure the perception of democracy, and it's always, as Marco was saying, it's always a balance between what is the actual data, what it shows us, and what are we measuring, so the kind of indicators that we're measuring when we speak about democracy and the perception of people who live in there. However, the truth of the fact of the matter is that only 8% of the world population lives in full democracy. And at the first glance, non-democratic regimes deliver economically for their citizens. So the temptation of falling into illiberal democracy and kind of, not taking this issue so seriously is that, okay, people in whatever country that is not so democratic, they still have a good living standard. So people are, you would hear, people are still happy, people are still, having access to education, having access to, they have a good living standard, they have what to eat and all that. And this is because a lot of the times we measure the wrong things. So we measure GDP per capita, which in fact, the way that we redistribute resources in society, it's not only about GDP, it's also about the quality of education, the quality of, safety net of society and all that. And if you look at this website, which is, for instance, healthcare, which is our world in data, then it shows that, for instance, Saudi Arabia scores quite high in GDP per capita, but the civil liberties are not so high. So I think this is also important to keep in mind when we speak about why democracy is so important and why is it so important to strive for democracy and not to fall into the trap of letting it go because it's not that bad. 2024, as we all know, is really a big year for democracy, for electoral democracy in particular. We have almost 25% of the world's population going to the polls. And some of the biggest democracies in the world, like the largest democracies in the world, they have elections. We've seen it in EU, of course, and apart from the EU elections, we have at member state level a couple of significant elections across the European Union and Europe in general. The US is going to the polls in November, and that's going to be, one of the most significant for the world because citizens have to choose between two very different visions about, how the US is going to look like in the next at least 4 years. India has elections, and some of them, even in Europe, for instance, they're with very, very high stake. Take, for instance, Moldova, that has a referendum to join the EU and the presidential elections. Georgia as well in October. So, very, very high stake elections. When it comes, sorry?
In Ukraine that will not have elections.
In Ukraine that will not have elections due to the martial law, indeed. When it comes to young voters, so in EU we've seen 60% of EU population is considered young and they were eligible to vote. We still don't have the data on youth turnout as far as I am aware. But I think it's really important to see the connection between these elections because it's really the year and the moment of truth and the moment when we take a stance as citizens and as humanity around the values that are important for us. However, does electoral democracy deliver solidarity? It's something that I've asked myself when I was preparing this presentation, and electoral democracy is mainly about representation, right? So the question is, the people who are running for elections, do they represent the young voters? Do they represent the interests, the values, the lifestyle, the concerns of young people? And also, do young voters actually feel that they can relate with the people that they can, put the stamp and the people that they see on the ballot. When we look at, how the average median age of head of state in Europe is 53 years old, whereas the demographic and the population is 44.4. But for the rest of the world, especially Africa, for instance, which is the youngest continent, the median age is 25 years old, and the heads of states are no younger than 63 years old at best. So you can see there is at least 2 generations probably gap between who people can choose for. As Mark was also mentioning, and he was very correctly pointing out that young people participate based on issues, so they don't really identify so much with the ideology left, right, but rather is about it's rather about the issues they consider important. The global themes that young people are looking at are increasingly interconnected. We speak about climate change, access to mental health, internet governance. So if we look at technology, we don't speak only about young people, they use TikTok, but what kind of decision making do young people have at the table when it comes to internet regulation and data protection and all that? Are they part of the conversation or not? Housing is an increasing challenge, and it's an increasing topic that is often on the ballot, and not only in Europe, where the far-right parties have really used this topic to put out simplistic answers to a very complex issue that is housing, but also in the US we see it more and more on the ballot. And something that maybe we should really ask ourselves as young people, but also youth workers or professionals who work with young people, are the participation spaces designed to allow and encourage participation? Are we creating the right spaces for young people, or are we just going on with the same way of organizing our society? Very quickly on youth vote. The fact that young people are not interested in politics because we don't see them at the polling station, that's maybe a myth. They are not interested in the way that the politics is actually organized. And maybe there is some food for thought to do around how do we organize politics and how do we organize power. The social media, the fact that young people using social media, it makes them radicalized and is a fertile ground for the far right, which it is to a certain point. But the growing body of literature, academic literature, actually shows that affective polarization is directly correlated with your life experience, not with how much time you spend on social media. So if you are marginalized and you don't have access to, I don't know, quality jobs and education, you are more likely to fall into this discourse. So we should pay attention to the root cause. And the fact that young people don't know how to vote, and this is probably something that you hear often. In fact, it's not true. It's just that they are not. First of all, politicians don't speak directly to young people. They don't identify them as an electorate. And second, it's not relatable, as we saw earlier, when it comes to who actually runs for public office. The only thing that I found around the EU elections and the youth vote is actually how young people voted. We've actually seen the center of EU Parliament moving to the right, so we definitely have more right-wing parties and even some new ones. With the exception of France and Germany, where young people did vote more to the right, in any other country it was the 50 plus who voted for the right-wing parties, so it was not the young people. Young people mainly voted left-oriented parties. So this is just in case, because there's a lot of noise in the social media, or even in the mainstream media, actually. In the mainstream media, I think I've seen it more and more that, oh, young people vote to the right, what do we do, what do we do? It's like just freaking out, when in reality, it's really not like that. With the exception of France and Germany, people tend to vote to the left. And yeah, maybe something that is really worth mentioning again, it's the housing crisis, that it was one of the main drivers for the youth vote in Europe. So solidarity, going a bit back to the solidarity and the youth programs, how do young Europeans experience solidarity through the programs, volunteering activities, solidarity projects, humanitarian projects. With the Erasmus Plus, it's basically youth exchanges and youth participation activities. But what about the political participation? What about, building political power and structural changes? And what about innovating in democracy? Are the programs fit? Do they allow us? Do they encourage us to think about how do we innovate when it comes to political participation? This is something, to think about, and if it's not, in my opinion, this is the right moment to put this on the table when we discuss with anyone from national agencies to the European Commission and beyond. Solidarity with whom? So recently, you've heard probably, and it's, speaking of buzzing, more and more the discussion about future generations. So we speak about solidarity with the current generations, with transnational solidarity, as you correctly mentioned. What about the future generations? And what is the role of the youth sector in addressing the way we think about future generations and the way we reflect that in our policy and programming thinking? The next 8 billion people of this planet will not live in Europe. They will live outside of Europe, mainly in Asia and Africa. So this is how it looks like. Maybe you know already that UN is hosting, if not the first, probably one of the first summits for future. It's happening now on 21st of September. And they've already, so you can already check, they have put forward some declarations. It's a very draft version, but it's a declaration of heads of states on the commitment for future generations. So we already start speaking about it at very international level with very little legal tools to actually defend future generations. Okay, so where are they gonna live? Most of them, as I said, in Africa and outside of Europe for sure, so it's really time to think about that, also from a European perspective and from a European programs perspective. And what does it mean in terms of development? So the next 8 billion people, they live in, I will take your question 1 second. They will live in spaces and in parts of the world where you know, the income group countries that it's low and very low, the human development index that goes beyond the GDP that I mentioned earlier, it's medium and low, and then bigger factor is also gender inequality. So how are gonna, you know, it just makes you think how exactly it's gonna look the society for the next 8 billion people that are gonna inhabit this planet. Most likely less equal and with less equity than what we have or than what we experience. When it comes to, yeah, this is something that I wanted to take from the presentation. Sorry for the text on the graph. So a key question when it comes to thinking about future generations and the solidarity with them is, do present decision-making processes take into account the future of future generation interests? What do you think? The way we do policy, do we think about the future generations?
No.
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 We do and we don't.
We think we do think, but we don't think.
Okay, that's
We pretend maybe.
With the climate change, some small changes.
Actually, one of the key roles that the young people and then the youth sector could play and should play is this long-term thinking around policy making. The Fridays for Futures, they actually brought I think the 4th wave of thinking about future generations in policy making. And this long-termism is strongly connected to climate. So we've only seen that, you know, the European Green Deal at the European level came after the Fridays for Future, having a vice president of the Commission putting Green Deal very high on the agenda and all that. And that incentivizes and forces politicians to think long-term, something that we don't do in policy making, not only youth policies, like in general, we don't do it. Why? Because politicians are definitely incentivized by the next elections and by gaining power to, you know, create their agenda and stay and implement their agenda, but they're incentivized mainly by the next elections. And the youth sector can play a very crucial role in shifting the paradigm around how do we think about policy making. And this is something that we should really own. Okay, we should really own and we should really push forward. However, at the moment, 81% of the constitutions in force actually do recognize the rights of the future generations, but we do not have the legal tools. So it's very rare that you can go and sue the state and then win the process because you didn't respect the future generations. There is a campaign, and I just wanted to draw attention on the fact that so the moment is now. We do have the right infrastructure to start including future generations in programming, in policy making, and show solidarity, approach solidarity also from that perspective. There is a network of institutions and heads of states that are committed to future generations. As I said, the UN is hosting the summit, and there is a school, so academia, that is researching on this. And there is also a campaign, for those more connected probably with the Brussels bubble, there is a campaign of European NGOs that are advocating for a commissioner on future generations. They just received a letter from Ursula von der Leyen saying, thank you very much, we will consider it, but we don't know what's going to happen. So maybe the youth commissioner is going to be also, will have also future generation in their portfolio. We spoke a bit, we just touched about power in youth participation, so I just want to stress that participation is about power and power is about resources. So always we should question ourselves and think what kind of voices we don't hear in society, and if they're not there, why they're not there. It's really about having access to resources. We don't see a lot of Roma people in the youth sector, or at least not in decision-making table. We don't see Black people, we don't see Muslim people, we don't see all these marginalized groups that, a lot of the times the thing is just let's blame them that they don't know how to write European projects, whereas for me it's also a neo-colonial approach in the way that African descendants having to think about the European values and how they are gonna make sure that this is first thing on their project. Not necessarily. So maybe we should really rethink the way we are allocating resources also through the European programs, especially if we want to have inclusivity and belonging that you very well mentioned, Marco. And when it comes to political innovation and organizations, okay, this is the last slide. So I just want to say that out there is the deliberative wave. So maybe some of you have heard of the Conference on the Future of Europe that brought the citizens' assemblies to the forefront of what do we do about this democratic deficit. So there are organizations like Mission Publique that is really focused on organizing citizens' assemblies. There is a whole methodology around that. It would be very interesting if the youth sector looks at this kind of ways of engaging young people. Then probably one of the newest initiatives is Nets for Them. It's a network of organizations, a lot of them Brussels-based, but with a lot of strong ties at national level that are focused on creating a social safety net for democracy. It's a project funded by the European Commission. They just launched it. Feel free to check it and maybe connect with them. BEMSOC is one of their stakeholders. Something very interesting, Run for Something, an apolitical foundation. Run for Something is based in the US. They are literally training up-and-coming political leaders, people who want to run for public office. They don't have the resources, the knowledge, the network. A lot of the times it's really about the network. So they provide this kind of infrastructure for young people who want to stand for public office. We don't have this kind of things in Europe. We do have the youth wings of political parties and the political foundations, mainly in Germany, but Southeast Europe, Balkans, other parts of Europe, we do not have a space for training young people to stand for public office. And our political foundation, they are based in Germany, and they are supporting what is now political entrepreneurship. So really around making sure that young people have access to power. You may want to check Nece Labs, I don't know how to pronounce it. They are a network of civic education labs, and their next event is in Tirana in October, if I'm not wrong. And just to close, so these are like a couple of ideas that I would like to leave you with. Innovation in democracy is funded by private money. Maybe it's time to look at our public resources and not depend on billionaires that now more and more see a stake in organizing power in society. So really think about it when we advocate for new programs. Future generations, it's really a quest of solidarity, not only with young people of today, but young people of tomorrow. Looking into the deliberative democracy, organizing small citizens' assemblies, young citizens' assemblies, maybe that's something that we want to consider. And in the end, I think the EU programs and the policies, they should look at democracy being future-proof, and because the risk of falling into the trap of illiberalism is very real. I will stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dear Corina, yeah.
Thank you, Corina, again for a very, very inspirational presentation. Maybe took us a little bit out of our EU bubble that we are maybe sometimes trapped in our minds. We do have some questions from the audience. Can I please just first pass the floor to the young man who raised his hand first during the presentation, and then we can continue, and I see you there.
Yeah, I googled it.
Ah. Google answered all of your questions that you had for Corina. Okay, good. I don't know who was it. Yeah, you and then maybe girl in the back. Yeah.
So, I'm not sure if I have questions and comments or comments with questions.
You can ask.
I think this is a very crucial debate. There's a lot of concepts that we are talking about and we are not going deep, and they need to be questioned. For example, we're talking a lot about democracy, and I wonder, what are we talking about when we talk about democracy? Because I have no idea what a democracy is. And I know that there's an ideal of democracy, and I know that there's a lot of different realities of democracy, and all of them are called democracies. I'm not sure if they are democracies or they are dictatorships that are called democracies, because we talk about representation, we are talking about power, the power of people to decide. We want to give access to people to decide. But are they really going to decide? Or are they going to participate in a discussion? And the thing is, for example, for young people, and I guess for all people, if we are discussing about a lot of things and we don't decide anything, or if I go somewhere, and I believe that it's the same for everyone, and I speak my voice, people will listen, but if after some time the only thing that people do is listening to me, and I don't see that I'm heard or considered, I will just give up. And I guess this is what we see from young people, not only, but people in general. Because we create this artificial show where people are supposed to be listened to and to be taken into account, but are they really being taken into account? And are they really being listened to? And then, for example, there's another concept that was presented, the concept of future generation. How can we decide for future generations if we don't know what the future generations are? So, unless we decide for them, how can we aspire to allow them to decide if we already decided for them? And how can we decide what the future generations will be and think? What is the pillars that sustain this decision? So we're talking about a lot about projection of sceneries of future, which is quite fantastic, and I'm not sure how real it is or it can be. And in all of this, there's also other questions that we have. You showed that the future of the world will be Africa and Asia. It's where we have now more people in the world, and they are growing, and they will be most of the population. So if we continue to talk about democracy, how can a minority, which is Europe, even if we link it with the US, how can a minority try to decide the future, the political future of the world, when we are taking into account the concept of representation and representativity? How can Europe dare to decide for the world what is going to be the future.
Yeah, thank
And
you.
what
for
are the
this.
standards for the future?
Thank you for this. To be honest, I don't know if I can answer everything, but maybe I can give you my perspective. I've also said that power is about resources, and most of the resources are actually concentrated in Europe and US. So if you look at that imbalance of access to resources, it's actually here. And indeed, it's not ethical that most of the people, and even today, most of the people affected by climate change are actually not the ones taking a lot of flights or producing a lot of changes in nature. I think we should and we are agreeing on some red lines, that it's important that all people have freedom. It's important that all people have, access to water and air and everything. And at least taking this into account for future generations, it's important to recognize that it is in their own interest to have the freedom to decide about themselves. Maybe I can just say that the way to do that, and it's, of course, it's symbolic, but how many, one of the ways maybe just to raise awareness is that when you have a meeting in the government or with the big companies or whatever, usually they leave a chair free, and that symbolizes the next generations, and that kind of forces you to, when you discuss about whatever decision you take, to take into consideration also that free chair that is, people are not here, but they will be affected by your decision. So, agree on some red lines, what is important, and also, rethink the way we redistribute resources. That's why the EU programs should not necessarily focus only on EU, but have an outlook to the broader world. It's a very long discussion.
Yeah. I'm sorry, we are really, really out of time for questions in this part, but I do see raised hands, and I do believe that there are perfect candidates for a Solidarity Lab with Corina right after lunch. A very short last question from the young lady who was patiently waiting all this time.
Thank you. Thank you for a fantastic presentation. I do have a question and a comment. So the first one is regarding the challenge that you mentioned, and for example, housing. So I'm going to take, for example, Spain. So there were recent demonstrations there about excessive tourism, and this is what people think is causing the housing problem there, and I think that this applies to several European countries. However, I think that people are also neglecting another reason, which is that you mentioned there are real reasons behind, for example, this problem other than tourism or immigration, as stated by some governments or the media, which is kind of like clauses in the law that favors the renters, and which actually kind of causes squatters to have, go into an apartment rented, stop paying the rent, and then you cannot get them out, even that they're not paying the rent and they are against the law. But the actual law is favoring that, and this is why people there are afraid to actually rent their apartments to Spaniards like them, and they favor the holiday rentals because they know that these people are going to get out of this apartment. But what I see in the media is that they are just amplifying the excessive tourism, and this is why the governments there started saying that they are going to limit the tourism or the available housing that tourists can rent starting 2027, I think. So, for example, regarding this situation, how can you actually make the public aware that there is actually a problem in the law or the policy that needs to be addressed or changed, other than, the reasons which are always taken for propaganda as the tourism or immigration? So that's my first question. And another comment, which is regarding the last slide, which is about the political organizations for training the young people, and that you mentioned the example of the US. I think the situation in Europe or even in Africa is pretty different than this one, so it might need to be addressed differently. Because, for example, the US, the organizations are privately funded, and the candidates there can receive private funding, which is announced for lobbying to certain groups or certain objectives. And this is actually not allowed in the EU nor in African countries, so you cannot receive like the public funding. And so how can you create these organizations while the laws are different and the situation is kind of different?
I will try to be very brief. So indeed, complex problems don't have simple solutions. The housing is one of them, and indeed it's easier to fall into this trap of extremists, whether it's one or the other, extreme tourism or people who refuse to leave houses that are not theirs. Overall, and this is one example, but we are surrounded by complex issues. I strongly believe in critical thinking and political education at school, so it's really important to make sure that these skills are embedded in our education and our society, and then young people or people who have direct interest, they have access to discussing and shaping these policies, because the devil is always in details. So, I mean, overall, it's really a matter of access to these discussions and policy shaping. And I don't know what was the second question. About civil society. Indeed, it's very different the way we fund and structure civil society, EU and US. It's not perfect anywhere. What I'm saying is that maybe we should learn what is good from other parts and try to adapt it to our model. And I think even Europe has a lot of faults with electoral funding. We may not be able to get a lot of money only from private sources, but then is less transparency, for example, in the electoral funding in Europe. And when it comes to EU elections, it's even more complicated because we don't have a European electoral law. So the way that we are doing campaigning for the European Parliament across the member states is completely different, and that also has to do with access to resources. The legislations are very different. So I'm just saying that maybe let's learn what is good, but then make sure that when we fund civil society, it serves the wider interest, not the interests of whoever puts in the money.
Thank you, Corina. And thank you for very interesting questions and a lot of interesting points raised. And I do encourage you to sign up for Corina's Solidarity Lab. And unfortunately, yeah, first clap. Yeah, Krishna, thank you.